It is the early hours of January 31st, 1943, and in the ruined basement of the Univermag department store in the center of Stalingrad, a lit candle gutters against the cold. Above, on the ground floor and in the stairwells, German soldiers lie wrapped in whatever cloth they can find, some already dead, most too weak to notice the difference. Down below, in a low room with a single working stove, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus sits at a table on which someone has unrolled a map. It is not a beautiful object. The paper is soft with handling, smudged with pencil, marked in places with the colored wax crayon that German staff officers use to plot the movement of divisions that, in most cases, no longer exist in any meaningful sense. Every line on it tells the same story from a different angle. The pocket that once stretched for 60 kilometers now covers a few streets. There is no red arrow pointing to relief. There is no blue line marking a corridor out. Paulus, unshaven, his face gray with exhaustion, looks at the map for what witnesses later described as a long time before he says almost nothing at all. Within hours, he will be a prisoner of the Red Army, the first German field marshal ever taken alive, and the map on that table, ordinary in every physical respect, will have done something that 6 months of shells, aircraft, and 500,000 lives could not quite manage on their own. It will have made the truth impossible to avoid. This is a story about that kind of map, the situation map, the unglamorous sheet of paper and colored pencil that sat behind almost every major decision of the Second World War, and about the particular moment at Stalingrad when it stopped being a tool of command and became, instead, a verdict. Historians still argue about exactly when Paulus privately accepted that the war in the East, and perhaps the war altogether, could not be won. What is not in dispute is that the paperwork of defeat, the humble Lagekarte, the situation map updated by hand every few hours by exhausted staff officers, was there in the room when it happened, and that it mattered. To understand why a piece of paper could carry that kind of weight, you have to understand the problem the German army had created for itself long before the map on Paulus's table was ever drawn. By November 1942, the Sixth Army had spent months grinding through Stalingrad street by street, factory by factory, in fighting so intimate that soldiers measured progress in meters and rooms rather than kilometers. Hitler had staked enormous prestige on capturing a city that bore his rival's name, and the German High Command, Oberkommando des Heeres, had convinced itself, largely through wishful thinking, that Soviet reserves in the region were spent. That confidence rested on intelligence assessments that dramatically underestimated Red Army strength south of the city, along the flanks held by weaker Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian formations. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a pincer attack aimed precisely at those exposed flanks, and within 4 days 2 Soviet spearheads met at the town of Kalach, sealing roughly 250,000 Axis soldiers inside a pocket that German officers began calling the Kessel, the cauldron. What followed was not a single catastrophic collapse, but a slow, documented, increasingly undeniable erosion, and it is this erosion that the situation maps captured with brutal precision. Each day, staff officers at 6th Army Headquarters and at higher commands further back updated their maps with the latest positions, using colored pencils and small paper or wooden counters representing divisions, corps, and airfields. Blue typically marked German and Axis forces, red marked the Soviets, and the practice, standard across most European armies of the period, was to redraw or overlay these markings as reports came in from the front. In late November, the map showed a huge pocket with 2 working airfields, Potomnik and Gumrak, through which the Luftwaffe was meant to supply the trapped army with roughly 500 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition daily. The maps that followed told a story of promises unmet. Actual daily deliveries rarely exceeded a fraction of that figure, closer to 100 tons on average by January, nowhere near enough to sustain an army that size through a Russian winter. By January 16, 1943, Pitomnik had fallen, and the map's supply lines, drawn as thin dotted arrows into the pocket, effectively vanished. When Gumrak followed on the night of 21st to 22nd January, there was, for the first time, no meaningful line on the map connecting the trapped Sixth Army to anything beyond it at all. The problem, in short, was not merely that the German army was losing at Stalingrad, it was that the army's own paperwork, the instrument built to help commanders win battles, was now recording in careful, methodical detail exactly how a battle was being lost, and there was no way to redraw it into something more comfortable. The situation map itself was a deceptively simple piece of technology, and it is worth explaining how it actually worked, because it explains why it proved so hard to argue with. German Army cartographic sections, working from Wehrmacht topographic survey maps at scales typically around 1 to 100,000 or 1 to 300,000, depending on the level of command, would mount a base map on a table or board, often under a sheet of transparent celluloid or glass, so that grease pencils could mark and rub away troop positions without damaging the paper beneath. At the level of an Army headquarters like Polis's, a dedicated intelligence and operations staff, the IA and IC sections maintained the map continuously, receiving radio and telephone reports from subordinate units roughly every few hours and translating them into symbols. Divisions became rectangles with unit designations written in shorthand inside them. Airfields became small circles with runway markings. Artillery concentrations, supply dumps, headquarters locations, all had their own symbols, a visual language any trained staff officer across the Wehrmacht could read at a glance, rather like sheet music that any orchestra member can interpret regardless of which city they trained in. The scale of the physical objects themselves was unremarkable. A folding table map, perhaps 1.5 meters across at corps level, smaller sheets for lower formations, but their informational density was enormous, condensing the fate of tens of thousands of men into a few square feet of paper. What made the Stalingrad situation maps different, and what makes this a story worth telling rather than a footnote about staff procedure, was the compression happening on them week by week. In November, the pocket on the map was a rough oval, roughly 40 kilometers wide. By late December, after the failure of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's relief attempt, Operation Wintergewitter, which had been intended to punch a corridor through to the trapped army and came to within roughly 48 kilometers of the pocket's edge before being halted, the map's outer boundary had not moved to meet it. That gap, roughly the distance from central London to Reading, was never closed, and every staff officer redrawing the map knew it represented the difference between rescue and annihilation. By mid-January, with the Soviets pressing from all sides in Operation Koltso, the ring, the pocket's boundary, shrank daily, sometimes visibly between one briefing and the next. The map that finally lay in front of Paulus at the end of January showed not an army in the field, but 2 isolated fragments clinging to a handful of city blocks, the northern pocket around the tractor factory under General Karl Strecker and the smaller southern pocket around Paulus's own headquarters. There was, quite literally, nowhere left to draw. The operational use of these maps and their psychological weight is documented in fragments rather than a single continuous narrative, because so many of the men closest to them either died in the pocket or, if captured, spent years in Soviet custody before any account reached the West. What survives suggests the maps were consulted obsessively even as their news grew worse. Paulus himself, in radio messages to Hitler that historians have been able to reconstruct from surviving transcripts, referred repeatedly to the shrinking area under his control and to supply figures that could only have come from the same reporting system that fed the map. On January 24th, he radioed that there were 18,000 wounded men without the slightest aid of bandages or medicines, and that further defense was, in his word, senseless. Hitler's replies forbade surrender outright. The map, in other words, was telling one story to the men who had to act on it, and a different story, or perhaps the same story simply refused, to the man in East Prussia who had the power to end the battle and chose not to. This is worth pausing on. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth comparing how the two sides use their own situation maps during this same battle, because the contrast is instructive. Soviet mapping under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky, who planned Operation Uranus, was built around concealment before the attack and rapid, confident redrawing after it, a system that assumed accurate reporting from the front would be acted upon quickly by commanders with real authority to move reserves. German mapping, by contrast, remained procedurally excellent, arguably the most methodical in Europe at the time, but was increasingly filtered through a command culture in which Hitler, sitting before what witnesses at the Wolfschanze headquarters in East Prussia described as a huge wall map of Russia, treated the paper record as something to be argued with rather than obeyed. Reports from the Sixth Army and the map data behind them were regularly qualified, softened, or simply disbelieved by the high command before they reached Hitler's table. American and British planners watching the Eastern Front from a distance, most notably at the Casablanca Conference held between 14th and 24th January 1943, just as the Stalingrad pocket was collapsing, drew rather different lessons from their own situation maps, which showed a German army group being fed piecemeal into a battle it could not sustain, and which helped harden Allied resolve around the demand for unconditional surrender that emerged from that same conference. In every case, the technology, the colored pencils, the celluloid overlays, the paper counters, was almost identical. What differed entirely was whether the men reading the map were willing to believe what it told them. The impact of that basement map and of the wider system of situation reporting that produced it is both easier and harder to measure than it first appears. It is easy to measure in the crudest sense, in the number roughly 275,000 men of Army Group B's southern wing who went into the pocket, of whom around 150,000 were killed or died there, and some 91,000, including 24 generals, were marched into Soviet captivity, fewer than half of whom would survive to see Germany again. It is far harder to measure in the more human sense the historians usually mean when they call Stalingrad a turning point, the moment at which officers across the Wehrmacht, and eventually ordinary Germans reading between the lines of state radio bulletins, began to understand that total victory in the East was no longer a plausible outcome. The map itself did not cause that shift. 6 months of encirclement, starvation, typhus, and a supply effort that never came close to meeting its targets did that. But the map gave the shift a shape, a physical object that senior officers could point to and say, without needing to argue politics or ideology, that this is simply where the lines now are. Surviving examples of Wehrmacht situation maps and cartographic equipment from the Eastern Front can today be seen in several German military history museums, including the Bundeswehr's Militärhistorisches Museum in Dresden, and in Russia at the Battle of Stalingrad Panorama Museum in Volgograd, the city Stalingrad became, standing close to the site of the very department store basement where this particular map did its work. Return for a moment to that basement, to the candle and the cold and the unremarkable sheet of paper on the table. It was not a secret weapon. It carried no explosive, no engine, no code that needed breaking. It was made of the same wax pencil and the same folded canvas-backed paper that staff officers had been using to plot battles for a generation, a technology so ordinary that nobody involved would have called it technology at all. And yet it did something that neither artillery nor propaganda nor the will of the Führer himself could fully undo. It recorded, patiently and without opinion, the difference between what German commanders had promised themselves and what was actually happening on the ground, redrawn every few hours until the redrawing left almost nothing to draw. Paulus surrendered that morning not because the map ordered him to, but because the map had, over many weeks, made every alternative account of reality impossible to sustain. 2 days later, on February 2, 1943, the northern pocket under Strecker capitulated as well, and the last line on the last version of that map, the line marking German resistance in Stalingrad, simply ceased to exist. Historians will keep arguing about exactly which moment, which report, which conversation finally convinced Friedrich Paulus that the war could not be won in the way Berlin insisted it still could. But the paper trail he left behind, and the maps that survive in archives and museum cases today, point to something quieter and perhaps more unsettling than a single dramatic revelation. It suggests that defeat, for the men who have to live through it, rarely arrives as a thunderclap. It arrives instead in pencil, redrawn a little further back each day until the space left on the page for hope simply runs out. A candle in a basement, a table, a sheet of worn paper, and a general who had run out of places left to point. That, in the end, was the map that told a field marshal the war he had been fighting was already over.